Hey, what's up, everyone? You are listening or watching my comic book journey podcast. I'm your host, Kennedy. And for today's episode, it is a Café du Comic, episode number 2. As part of my comic book journey podcast, where I don't talk about comic book, a specific comic book. I talk about the industry or just, life as a comic book collector. And a lot of people wonder, is it worth collecting comic books? And I'm going to tell you that times have changed in terms of what the comic book collector is. You can just type comic book on YouTube and you'll see how it's changed. It's almost similar to the Hot Wheels collector, where people buy Hot Wheels not for the purpose of enjoying the car, but more of hoping to get that payday to flip. It's part of what people are collecting these days. Maybe baseball cards or sports cards in general, and it's more of trying to flip things and trying to make a profit, getting it graded, making a profit. And I guess I could say that it just depends on how you are with as a comic book collector. There are things to consider, and this is something you'll probably see. For a lot of comic book collectors, a lot of their stuff unfortunately ends up being thrown away if you pass away. You cannot expect your family members, wife or child or children to say, hey, we are going to go through every comic book and find which one is worth a lot and make money that way. They don't have that perception, or unless they you let them know about the importance of comic books. More than likely, a lot of family members don't know that, especially if they're left behind with all these comic book boxes. And for a lot of people, these are no different from the books you may have in your bookshelf, that these could be thrown away to make space. We need to get rid of them. So may it be an estate sale where they sell a full box for maybe $10 or $5, or you try to find a way to your family might have to find a way to get rid of them. And unfortunately, they can't just take it to a comic book store. They'll probably take it to a swap meet or a collectible shop, which they probably wouldn't get that much. So the thing is that in this day and age, comic books, you'll have comic book collectors who will sell these comics at a comic book convention, eBay. But in terms of comic books today, it's a lot different now than when I was a lot younger. When I was a teenager, I could always depend on the local comic book shop to sell things, or even the local hobby shop. But those are now becoming less and less. I think with comic book collectors, a lot of people collected them back then, as it was part of the way we consumed entertainment. And it's the same way people consumed entertainment with Blu-rays and video games. But as you notice, times have changed now. Everything has gone digital. And one of the things about digital that people don't have to worry about is clutter. And for a lot of comic book collectors, this is probably the main thing that may lead to a lot of arguments with your significant other about how much space is being utilized, or how much of your collection is taken over the house or room or so. But the thing is that you don't have to worry about that anymore. So if you are a comic book collector and you're reading it via digital, then all power to you. But then again, you go back to the question is of what happens if you pass away? What happens to your digital collection? Video games, music, comic books. Do you have something set, in your will, or do you have something set that your family members know? that after you pass away, they'll have access to this? Will they care to have access to this, or does it die with you? And I will tell you that for a lot of comic book collectors, there are those who are able to sell their stuff, but for those who can't and they just pass away or something happens, you know, your comic book collection is something that probably might be trashed or something. It's really hard to say, but unfortunately, you will see a lot of estate sales, a lot of people selling comic books really cheap, or garage sales, because either their family member or child doesn't want them anymore, or that person has passed. And that's just the reality of it. With anything, really, right? You pass away, where does your collection go to? And so the question is that how long do you plan to own that? And do you just plan to store it? Do you plan to read it? And the reason why I created this podcast is that I grew up with these comic books. They're a big part of my life. And I look at this podcast as this is the final run. After I read these, will I sell them? Don't know. But the thing is that I know that it does take up a lot of room. And I do know that there has to be, there will be a time, maybe, maybe for retirement, or you have to live in a smaller, place. Something is going to happen with your collection, maybe toys, comic books, and you're going to have less space than what you had when you were much younger. So there's a lot of considerations that you have to make. And if you are one of those people who collect slabs and you just have a few, that are graded, that's perfectly fine. A lot of those people who do that, a lot of them do it because they love that certain comic book and want it graded, or they want to flip it and sell it. And most of the time it's the latter. But the thing is, in terms of the comic collector, those who bought things at the supermarket, newsstand, those who bought things at their local comic book shop or magazine shop at the time when they had those. And back when I collected in years, I could always go to a supermarket and know there will be comic books being sold. I could go to certain bookstores and find comic books being sold. But that's no longer the case. Things have changed now. And even with the comic book shop, we used to have several local. I remember we had about 3 or 4 at one time. We have none now. The only comic book shop nearby is probably an hour away. And it's just the state of how things are. And I think also you are seeing people who are collecting the omnibus. You are seeing people who are going digital, legally and illegally. And it's just it's just the state of how things are. And I could tell you, there have been times in my life where I've tried to sell comic books, and I looked at it as more as I want to offload major collections, and I'll sell it really cheap, $50 for 50 comic books. Doesn't matter what, I just want them to go to a good home. And I thought that, but really, I'm noticing more and more people tend to just want one certain issue. And as for the whole comic book run, you may be lucky if you find someone who will buy that whole run, especially if you have it cheap enough, and if you have a nice title that's probably worth a lot, then they'll probably get it. But a lot of the titles that you have, especially if you collected many decades worth of them, they may or may not be what readers want. What readers want now is, let's go back to this. Let's compare. Let's say that Star Wars. We'll use Star Wars as an example. We know the vintage Kenner Star Wars are highly collectible. They were the first ones, right? But let's say that you didn't collect the Kenner, but you started going for the first trilogy, and you have the Clone Wars or I forgot all the titles now, but let's say you had one of the newer trilogies or even the newer movies or the latest movies that came out for Star Wars. Can you make money off those? And the thing is that people want the vintage because they are the classic ones, the Kenner ones, or people want the newer ones because they have more articulation. They have better paints. But whether or not people want those other ones, I can tell you, back then, that was probably the prime time. These days, probably not so much. I will tell you, I do own a lot of Star Wars. And trust me, I've tried. Like for instance, I have a full set of one of the movie lines of all the toys, and I do not want to sell them as separate. I want to sell them as a set. Who is interested in buying the set for something that old? And today's generations of collectors, a lot of them are, you got video game collectors or so, but you have people who are really, they're a little bit more proactive and forward thinking. Not in terms of career, but in terms of, not trying to be their hoarder. And maybe that's why I think a lot of people, a lot of children grew up with parents who collected things, comic books, Blu-rays, DVDs, Laserdiscs. These kids don't deal with that now. Everything's all digital. And I think that's something that that is definitely, going to be very interesting to see how, yes, there are younger people who are collecting vinyl, but they know they can make money by selling their vinyl too. Comic books is not a sure thing. And you can have your things all CGC if you want and spend the money for it. But really, what people are looking for are first appearances or something very special. Let's say a Secret Wars issue or a Spider-Man issue featuring the first black outfit, right, that became Venom, or the first issue of this or the first issue of that, the first issue of Silver Surfer or Black Panther. Those things are popular, of course. First appearance of the Uncanny X-Men with Wolverine and the newer group that came out at back then in the 70s or early 80s. I think it was late 70s, right? But yeah, those are definitely going to be popular. First appearance of Batman, Spider-Man, Superman, you name it. Those are going to always find a seller. There will always be someone who wants that issue. But let's say that you don't have that issue and you have this full run of comic books from the 70s through the 2000s. And while there are some that people may want, again, first appearances, a lot of those other issues they may not want. Only the true collectors who are already collecting the floppies and just want to fill up holes in their collection. And that's where I am. I was a person who collected and do not purchase from a comic book shop because, again, a lot of them have closed down. But I was purchasing from comic shops online to fill holes in my collection. But then as you get older, a lot of things start to concern you about space, about what happens if I move away, What happens if I move to another country? All that stuff. I remember for video games, we'll use GameStop. Well, GameStop it is. We'll use GameStop as an example. And if you live in a area that is military based, you know that a lot of the used video games are games without the original cover, without the original case. And for a lot of hardcore video game collectors, they hated that. For me, you know, it was the reality. I mean, I didn't like it either, but at the same time, and you know, I understood because a lot of military people didn't have the space for that. And they had to pretty much keep things light. And so a lot of them traveled with video games, you know, in convenient areas where they can put a lot in there without having to carry the cases. And then you have your true collector who wants nothing but the pristine manuals, the boxes, everything in intact. I recently made the decision to go through my video game collection. This includes Game Boy Advance, DS, 3DS, PSP, Vita, Switch, and this includes even PlayStation, PS2, and so forth. I made the conscious decision to trash every case. And I know this makes collectors cringe, but the thing is, I'm the collector who does things to make myself happy by playing them, reading them, but I was never in it for the profit. Especially if you are a person who has a nice job and you know already your collection is as good as you'll know if you have something special in your collection. If you have that one or two or whatever issues that people want, you probably will offload it someday or but the thing is that you'll have hundreds of other comics in your collection that are not special, that are not super. And the only thing is that for you, it's more important for you as a reader and those who grew up reading those comic books in that comic book line. So, I could tell you right now, let's say that Valiant. I love Valiant comics back then. And Unity, my gosh, those things were so expensive at the time. They're worth probably nothing these days, right? Only to those who enjoy Valiant comics and just wants to fill a hole in their comic book collection. But see, that's what I'm talking about. For me, I love collecting comic books, the comic book lines, the comic book, a series, a full comic book run if possible. But that's for my own personal happiness, not to make money or anything like that. And I know if I was to pass away right now, that collection is probably going to be trashed or sold in an estate sale or something like that. So that's why I look at this as my comic book journey podcast as that final run for me to read all the comic books I've had and revisit it and enjoy it. And I have way too many comic books, manga, you name it. But my feeling is, if I could sell it, if I want to sell it, then fine. But if I can't, then so be it. I don't know what will happen to it. And there's just so many considerations in life now these days, with a lot of people dealing with jobs, especially jobs that you got really paid well, and then jobs that you lose. You'll have to relocate, you'll have to move, and those things you have to take into consideration. There's people who, of course, they live in the same house that they grew up with, and they or inherited, that they can live there forever, and they'll hey, we have my comic book collection, I'm good. But you still have to deal with what happens if you pass, and those are things that a lot of people don't want to think about. They think of their collections as, oh, I want to make money now, or again, you have different types of collectors: those who want to make money and flip things, and those who just read it for their personal enjoyment, that don't care about the monetary side of it. And for me, I'm that latter. I don't care about making money off it. I just read it because it's something I grew up with. I enjoy it. But at the same time, I am conscious of what happens to this collection if something happens. And I think those are things that people really need to think about. I know with a digital collection, no clutter. That saves one problem. But again, what happens to that digital collection if you pass away? Do you think your family member wants to read it? Probably not, unless they love comic books as well. But most of the people I know, especially guys, it's usually them that like it. They got their kids into reading it maybe when they're younger, and maybe wife reading a few. But most likely, from the people I know, that it's just them for their own personal purpose of reading comic books, that they are entertained by it. I do, I used to have a lot of VHS tapes, but you know what? What good is that now? I still have my Laserdisc collection, but again, what good is that now? Who really wants Laserdisc, and do you want to spend all that effort, especially the way eBay and things have changed in terms of selling things? And I used to, like as mentioned, I used to collect Star Wars, and I would sell Star Wars, and then next thing you people trying to rip you off, saying it came in damaged no matter how much protection you put in it, and they show you pictures of a smashed box, and you could only think, I wonder if they switched it with their own damaged product to get a payday. I don't know. So the thing is, yeah, I'm wary about eBay for certain things, because I've sold a lot on eBay, but I've seen the bad. And this is not just comic books, and I've seen it happen with Blu-rays, where Blu-rays, I've not watched the Blu-ray, and someone says, well, it all came all scratched up. What do you do then? Or watch. I used to have a huge G-Shock collection, and I would sell them, and people would say, oh, it melted and it's all damaged. I'm like, what do you mean? G-Shocks are really freaking durable. They really... And you just realize that there are people out there, unscrupulous people, who'll take advantage of you. And while I would say there's more good people out there, unfortunately, it just takes several of those bad seeds just to really screw your experience on eBay for selling stuff. So those are things that comes to mind. Trust me, I'm gonna have to be dealing with it soon. I'm reading this comic book line, as many comic books lines that I can. I see it as this is my final run. That's why I created this podcast, as more of a me keeping a record of it, like a diary. Just writing about my journey. And I will say I love comic books for what it gave me, as a child, as a teenager, and as an adult. But the thing is that, I am conscious of about what will happen to the collection, and I could tell you my feeling is that people will collect, and if something happens, it happens, but at least they had that enjoyment. I wish I could just say, yeah, I'll just read it, enjoy it, and keep it in my house, but that, to me, that I would be selfish to say that I left this behind, leaving a burden, because I have so many. And so there's things I know in life that I have to look straight forward and make some major decisions. Maybe not now, but I know one of these days it will be coming up, because when you have a huge collection, it could be too much. And it's one thing if you have only like 3 or 5 comic book boxes, but when you have 10 or 15 times that amount, then it becomes a little problematic. And yeah, that's pretty much it. So I hope this makes sense. I think everyone goes through this. A lot of comic book collectors, especially if you've been collecting for such a long time. So it's interesting because you see some stuff on the internet about people who passed away, and they left their collection to a club or to their friends or so forth. And I was reading about this guy who had a huge car collection of models and vehicles, Hot Wheels, and so forth, and he's had this collection ever since he was a kid, and he passed away, I think in his 60s or so, and they visited his house and they were shocked to see that whole collection. But he never sold it. He just kept it there for his pure enjoyment. But the thing is, again, is that we all change, and people change. Especially, there's things, again, that people do not like to think about. The future, how much money you have, how much money you may have. Can you make those house payments? Do you have a good job to pay for that? Or even if you have, you come from a family that has Alzheimer's or dementia, what happens if you can't read those books that you enjoyed anymore? That you're not able to recognize them anymore? Those are things. There's so many factors in life where, in this day and age, where things are not promised, when things are not. I know a lot of people back then. When I grew up, I had family members who grew up and retired from the company that they started when they were younger. Never had to move. They were good. And then I know families, people who have, after people leave, the children left home and their spouse has passed away, and they move into an apartment, much smaller space. There's just so many factors that we all have to face as we get older. Financially, health, or just, keeping, spouse or family members happy. Because they put up with your collection for so long, can you expect them to put up with that collection for life? That's another thing, especially if you have so much and it's come near hoarding. But anyway, I think those are things that are in my mind right now, and just wanted to talk about it. And hopefully you can chime in. Okay, everyone, you take care, and I'll see you later. Wink, wink, and see you later, everyone. Bye-bye.